A lonely elderly man finds a mysterious mare covered in bees on his farm, but when anonymous letters begin to arrive, he realizes someone doesn't want the truth to come to light. It was between the sigh of the wind and the distant murmur of waters that old Jim heard it. A muffled sound, almost a lament, coming from behind the oak trees. The old farmer stopped, sharpened his ears, and followed the direction of the noise. The sight he found left him paralyzed. A snow-white mare, motionless, under a yellow maple tree, covered by a vibrant dark layer of bees. The animal wasn't struggling, just keeping its eyes half closed, as if it had accepted its fate. Jim didn't hesitate. With the calmness of someone conversing with an old friend, he approached slowly, murmuring words of comfort. The bees buzzed, in an almost hypnotic rhythm, showing no aggression. Carefully, he placed a rope around the animal's neck and guided it to a nearby creek. The cold water drove away part of the swarm, and using a cloth he always carried in the pocket of his checkered shirt, he gently cleaned the white coat of the mare. "Easy, girl. Everything's going to be all right now," he whispered, observing the animal's brown eyes that seemed to carry an ancient wisdom. Upon returning to the farm, leading the mare carefully, Jim noticed something stuck to the wooden gate. It was a small yellowed envelope with no name or address. Inside, just a piece of paper with a single sentence written in careful calligraphy. "Some rescues demand their price." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The old man tucked the paper in his pocket, intrigued. He didn't mention the note to anyone, not even to Martha, the woman who came 3 times a week to help with household chores. He settled the mare in the abandoned stable, where years ago he had kept his horses. He gave her fresh water, clean hay, and watched as she ate with moderate appetite. There was something in that animal's gaze that intrigued him, as if she carried stories that couldn't be told. The next day, while feeding the mare, which he decided to call Luna, in honor of the moon goddess, for her white coat that shimmered under the moonlight, Thomas, his neighbor, appeared leaning over the fence. Thin, with small restless eyes under his dirty straw hat, he had a smile that never reached his eyes. "Fine animal you've got there, old Jim," he commented, chewing on a toothpick. "But do you know where she came from?" "Found her in the pasture, and near the creek," Jim replied without giving many details. "That mare—" Thomas narrowed his eyes. "She looks familiar to me. I think she was from Maple Creek Farm, the one that burned down about 20 years ago, on the other side of the valley." Jim felt a shiver run down his spine. Maple Creek Farm. That name still provoked whispers and averted glances among the oldest residents of the region. The fire that consumed the property had become a sort of local legend, mainly because the owner, Caroline Wilson, and her young daughter were never found after the tragedy. "Nonsense, Thomas. That happened a long time ago." "This mare can't be more than 10 years old," Jim retorted, trying to end the conversation. "Just saying," Thomas shrugged with false innocence. "But you know how it is. Dig in old dirt, and you might unearth what you shouldn't." As soon as Thomas left, Jim noticed that Luna was restless, pawing at the hard-packed earth floor of the stable, her eyes fixed in the direction of the gate, as if she could see something beyond it. In the following days, the presence of the white mare quickly spread through the small town of Millfield. Stories grew like weeds in fertile soil. Some said she was an enchanted animal, others that she brought bad luck, but everyone seemed to avoid direct eye contact with Jim when they saw him at the Sunday market or at Mr. Parker's general store. It was on one of these mornings that Mrs. Rose appeared at the farm. Small and agile despite her 70 years, with grey hair always tied in a loose bun, she was known for her honey and homemade remedies. She arrived carrying a basket covered by a flowered cotton cloth. "Good morning, Jim," she greeted with the gentle voice characteristic of hers. "I heard about your new companion. I brought some natural remedies that might help." Without waiting for an invitation, Rose headed for the stable. Upon seeing Luna, she stopped abruptly, the color draining from her face. "It can't be—" she murmured more to herself than to Jim, who followed her intrigued. "Do you know this mare, Mrs. Rose?" he asked, observing the woman's reaction. Rose hesitated, her wrinkled fingers firmly gripping the handle of the basket. "I've been raising bees since I was a girl, Jim. And I know they don't choose just any animal to protect," she finally said, slowly approaching Luna, who remained calm, as if she recognized the woman. "The bees covered her, didn't they? Like a living cloak?" Jim nodded, surprised. "How did you know?" "Because I've seen it before," she replied, her teary eyes caressing the mare's white coat. "This mare, she belonged to my sister, Caroline." The name fell heavily between them. Caroline Wilson, the woman who lived at Maple Creek Farm with her daughter Sarah, just 5 years old. The woman everyone believed had died in the Great Fire that consumed the main house and part of the plantations. The woman who was never found. "That's impossible, Mrs. Rose. The fire was 20 years ago. This mare wouldn't be so young." "Some things don't follow time as we know it, Jim," she replied enigmatically. "Luna was always special. My sister said she had the gift of finding her way back no matter how far she was." As Rose applied an herbal ointment to the mare's flank, she told him that her sister Caroline was a beekeeper like her. A woman of strong and independent personality, she had moved to Maple Creek Farm after separating from her husband, a businessman from the city. On the farm, she raised her daughter alone, dedicating herself to honey production and the cultivation of medicinal herbs. The bees seemed to respond to her touch in an almost supernatural way, and Luna, the white mare, was little Sarah's inseparable mount. "I always thought it strange that they never found anything," Rose confessed, "but now, with Luna's return, something tells me the past wants to be unearthed." Rose departed, leaving behind more questions than answers, and a pot of beeswax that, according to her, would help protect Luna from changes in the weather. That night, Jim couldn't sleep. Rose's words echoed in his mind. Why would the mare have appeared on his property? Why now, 20 years later? And who had left that mysterious note on the gate? In the morning, another letter was waiting for him. This time, held under a stone on the front porch. The same elegant handwriting. "You don't know what you're getting into. Return what you found." What should he return? The mare? Or was there something more that he wasn't seeing? Luna continued to demonstrate strange behaviors. Whenever she was taken to graze near the property line, she would balk and fix her gaze toward the mountains where the ruins of Maple Creek Farm stood. Sometimes in the middle of the night, Jim would hear her whinny as if calling for someone. And the bees, they continued to appear, not in aggressive swarms but like silent sentinels. They would land in the vicinity of the stable, on the flowers of the abandoned garden, on the windows of the house, watching like guardians of an ancient secret. It was during a rainy afternoon, while fixing a fallen fence at the back of the property, that Jim made the first significant discovery. As he pulled out a rotten stump, his eyes caught a metallic glint among the roots. Curious, he dug with his hands and found a small silver bracelet. Delicate and childlike, with small charms in the shape of bees and a heart where it read, almost erased by time, "For my little girl, Sarah, with eternal love, Mom." Jim's heart raced. That couldn't be a coincidence. He tucked the bracelet in his shirt pocket, feeling its weight as if he carried a piece of the past that someone wanted to keep buried. The next morning, upon opening the door to receive the milkman, he found another letter. This time the message was threatening. "You found what you shouldn't have. Stay away from the mare and whatever else you discovered, or everyone will know about your past." His past? What past? Jim was confused. He had lived in the region for only 10 years, after retiring from life as a teacher in Chicago. He had bought the property at a below-market price and lived peacefully with Margaret until her passing. He had no secrets, at least none that could compromise him. He decided it was time to investigate more deeply. At the Sunday market, while buying fresh vegetables at Mrs. Thompson's stall, an elderly lady with a patterned headscarf approached him, looking around as if fearing being observed. "You're the owner of the white mare, aren't you?" she asked in a low voice. "Yes, I am." "That mare, I would recognize her anywhere. It was the one little Sarah never parted from. After that sad event, no one ever saw either of them again." Before Jim could ask questions, The lady quickly moved away, getting lost among the colorful stalls of the market. Thomas, who seemed to always be nearby lately, approached with his fake smile. "Another one who believes in ghost stories, old Jim," he commented, pointing in the direction where the lady had disappeared. "These country folks are too superstitious, but you as an educated man shouldn't listen to such nonsense." "I don't know, Thomas," Jim replied, holding the neighbor's gaze. "Sometimes the stories people tell have more truth than we'd like to admit." Thomas hardened his expression for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. "Just be careful. People in this town don't like it when the past is stirred up. They're afraid of what might come to light." That same afternoon, upon returning home, Jim had a surprise. A young woman of approximately 25 was standing in front of the farm gate. Tall, with long brown hair and intense eyes, she carried only a small backpack and was looking curiously at the property. "Can I help you?" asked Jim, approaching. "I hope so," she replied with a shy smile. "My name is Emma Hayes. I'm looking for information about the old Maple Creek farm, and they told me in town that you have a mare that might have come from there." Jim felt his heart race. There was something familiar about the young woman's face, but he couldn't identify what. "I'm Jim Miller. May I ask why you're interested in Maple Creek Farm?" "I'm researching unsolved stories from rural Illinois," she replied, but her eyes briefly looked away, betraying the lie. "I'm a journalist, and the case of the fire and the disappearance of Carolyn Wilson and her daughter has always intrigued me." Jim didn't fully believe her, but decided to give the young woman a chance. "Come in, let's talk inside. The afternoon is getting chilly." As they walked toward the house, Luna, who was grazing peacefully in the adjacent field, abruptly raised her head. Her ears perked up and she whinnied loudly, an almost desperate sound. Before Jim could react, the mare galloped toward them, jumping the low fence with surprising agility. Emma froze, her wide eyes fixed on the animal approaching her. For a moment, Jim feared Luna would run over the young woman, but the mare stopped, less than a yard from her, whinnying softly and shaking her head, as if trying to say something. And then something extraordinary happened. Emma extended her trembling hand and touched Luna's muzzle, who immediately calmed down. A small group of bees that had been flying nearby gently landed on the young woman's shoulder, showing no aggression whatsoever. "Luna," Emma murmured, tears shining in her eyes. "You recognized me." In that instant, Jim knew. It wasn't Emma Hayes standing before him. It was Sarah Wilson, the missing girl from Maple Creek Farm, now a grown woman. In the cozy kitchen of the house, as the afternoon progressed outside, Sarah recounted her story. How she had survived the fire thanks to her mother, who hid her in an underground cellar built especially to store the honey produced on the farm. How, after the fire had died down, her mother had placed her on Luna and instructed her to ride to the neighboring town where a trusted friend lived. Mom said she would come right after, that she just needed to get some important documents, explained Sarah, her voice choked with emotion. But she never arrived. Her friend, Mrs. Bennett, took me in and, to protect me, created a new identity. I became Emma Hayes, a distant niece who had come to live with her after losing my parents in an accident. "Protect you from what?" asked Jim, confused. "From what really happened that night," Sarah replied, her eyes now hard as stones. "The fire wasn't accidental, Mr. Miller. Someone wanted my mother out of the way, someone who never imagined I would survive, and one day returned to discover the truth." Sarah explained that for years she believed Mrs. Bennett's story, until after the lady's death she found old letters and documents kept in a wooden box. Among them, a letter from her mother, written a few days before the fire, expressing fear for her life and her daughters. Mom had discovered something, Mr. Miller, something that involved illegal land exploitation, document forgery, and political manipulation. Something that could compromise some of the most powerful families in the region. The young woman took a worn diary from her backpack. "This was my mother's diary. I managed to recover it from the ruins of the farm, where I secretly returned a few months ago. It mentions names, dates, suspicious meetings, but something is missing." She wrote that she had stored concrete evidence in a place that only Luna knew. Jim felt a chill run down his spine as he remembered the bracelet he had found. "I think I found something that might interest you," he said, removing the delicate object from his shirt pocket. Upon seeing the bracelet, Sarah let out a sob, her fingers trembling as she touched the aged metal. "It was mine. Mum gave it to me on my 5th birthday shortly before the fire," she whispered, her thumb caressing the small charms. "How did you find it?" Jim explained where and how he had found the jewel, also describing the strange letters he had been receiving and the peculiar behavior of the mare. "Luna was always special," confirmed Sarah, looking out the window where the mare was now grazing calmly. "Mum said she had the gift of sensing danger and finding safe paths. The bees protected her, as they protected all of us. It was as if they understood we were family." "Why did you come back only now?" questioned Jim. "After so long." "I was afraid for a long time. Mrs. Bennet warned me that the people involved were still around, watching, waiting for me to appear. But after she was gone, I realized I couldn't leave this story buried. Not just for justice to my mother's memory, but because there are lands, my lands by right, that were illegally taken after our absence." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of hooves approaching. Looking through the window, Jim saw Thomas dismounting from his horse. The neighbor seemed nervous, repeatedly looking behind him as if fearing being followed. "You'd better hide," he quickly told Sarah. "That man, Thomas, has shown suspicious interest in the mare since I brought her in." Sarah obeyed, retreating to the guest room while Jim went to receive the unexpected visitor. "Mr. Miller," greeted Thomas, removing his hat in a false gesture of respect. "Forgive the unannounced visit. I came to talk about that offer I made you for your property." Jim frowned. Thomas had mentioned in passing that he would be interested in buying his land but had never made a concrete offer. "I'm still not interested in selling, Thomas." "I would increase the offer significantly," insisted the neighbor, a strange gleam in his eyes. "Considering the problems that have arisen recently." "What problems?" "Why, the mare," replied Thomas with a careless gesture. "The story's in town. It's only going to get worse, you know. Soon they'll associate your property with misfortunes, hauntings. The land value will drop. Better to sell while you can still get a good price." Jim held the neighbor's gaze. "Thanks for your concern, but I intend to stay. This land has served me well." Thomas squeezed his hat between his hands, visibly annoyed. "You don't understand this story about the mare, about Maple Creek Farm. There are things that should remain in the past." "Such as what exactly?" provoked Jim carefully, observing the man's reaction. A flash of anger crossed Thomas's gaze, quickly replaced by a forced smile. "Old stories, superstitions, nothing important. But I warn you as a friend, be careful what you dig up around here. Some discoveries bring more problems than answers." After Thomas's departure, Jim found Sarah watching from the window, her expression somber. "Do you know him?" asked Jim. "Not personally, but I recognize the name from my mother's documents," she replied, biting her lower lip. "Thomas Baker. He was the foreman for Robert Fletcher, the farmer who tried to buy our land numerous times." "Robert Fletcher? The current mayor's father?" Sarah nodded. "Exactly. The Fletchers always had an interest in Maple Creek Farm. Our lands contain springs that feed the entire region. Whoever controls the water controls the local power." Night fell, enveloping the farm in a cloak of darkness dotted with stars. Jim insisted that Sarah stay, at least until they better understood what was happening. He prepared the guest room, which in the past had been his granddaughter Olivia's during vacation visits, and improvised a simple dinner. During the night, the sound of hooves awakened Jim. From his window he saw Luna, agitated, trotting in, circles in the pasture, her ears up, alert. Without making noise so as not to wake Sarah, the old man took his hunting rifle, more as a precaution than with the intention of using it, and went out to check what was happening. The full moon bathed the field in silvery light, making Luna's coat almost ghostly. Jim approached, trying to calm her, when he noticed movements in the shadows near the fence that divided his property from the neighboring farm. "Who's there?" he called, raising his rifle. Silence. Then the sound of breaking branches and the hurried noise of someone moving away. Jim didn't pursue the intruder, but found, thrown on the ground, a piece of paper. A new letter, hastily written. "She's back. We're all in danger now. The next morning, Jim showed the message to Sarah, who paled. "They know I'm here," she murmured, instinctively pressing the bracelet she now wore on her wrist. "But how did they find out so quickly?" "I think we've been watched for longer than we imagine," replied Jim, looking out the window to the fields that stretched to the distant hills. "This is a small town. News travels fast," Sarah agreed, concerned. "We need to find what my mother hid. It must be something important enough to justify all this." Jim pondered for a moment. "You said your mother mentioned a place that only Luna knew." "Yes, but I have no idea what that means." "Maybe Luna can show us," suggested the old man, a plan forming in his mind. "Since she arrived, she's been trying to go in a specific direction. She always gets restless when she looks toward the mountains." Sarah's eyes widened in understanding. "You think she wants to go back to Maple Creek Farm?" "Or to somewhere on the way," replied Jim, already preparing a small backpack with water and some provisions. "If we let Luna loose, maybe she'll lead us there." The idea was risky, but it made sense. Luna, even after 20 years, had appeared precisely on Jim's property, which was on the path between the town and the ruins of Maple Creek Farm, as if she were completing an interrupted route. They decided to act quickly, taking advantage of daylight. Sarah saddled Luna with skill, despite the years without riding. The familiarity between the two was evident. The mare remained calm under the young woman's touch, as if she had been waiting for this reunion for 2 decades. "I'll go with you," insisted Jim, saddling his own horse, a gentle chestnut named Thunder. "It's not safe to go alone, especially if someone is watching us." They departed via the secondary road, avoiding the main one to not attract attention. Luna led the way, determined and alert, as if she really knew where she was going. Sarah guided her gently, occasionally leaning forward to whisper words of encouragement in the animal's ear. Jim followed her, surprised by the young woman's skill as a horsewoman. It was as if the years hadn't passed, as if she was still the little girl who grew up riding the white mare every day. After almost an hour of riding, leaving the road behind and following increasingly narrow trails through the dense vegetation, Luna stopped abruptly. They were in a small clearing surrounded by ancient trees, a place that seemed untouched by time. "Do you recognize this place?" asked Jim, dismounting carefully. Sarah got down from Luna, looking around with a confused expression. "Not exactly, but there's something familiar," she replied, absent-mindedly caressing the mare's neck. "Are we on Maple Creek farmland?" "Not yet. This is a sort of no-man's land, between my property and the old boundaries of your family's farm." Luna whinnied softly and walked to a large oak tree in the center of the clearing. The immense and ancient trunk seemed to guard secrets in its rugged bark. The mare pawed the ground repeatedly, near the exposed roots of the tree. "She wants to show us something," murmured Sarah, approaching. Suddenly a familiar buzz filled the air. Small bees began to appear, forming a golden whirlwind around them. Jim instinctively took a step back, but Sarah remained still, as if she understood the silent code between the bees and the white mare. "They're guiding us," said the young woman, observing the flight pattern of the insects, which now concentrated in a specific area between the roots of the oak. Together, they began to dig at the indicated spot. The soil was soft, as if it had been turned before. They didn't have to go very deep until their hands found something solid, a metal box, the type used to store important documents, protected by a layer of beeswax that had waterproofed it during all those years. With trembling hands, Sarah removed the box from the hole. The lock was rusty, but yielded easily when forced with the small knife that Jim always carried. Inside, they found exactly what Caroline Wilson had promised to keep safe: original property documents of Maple Creek Farm, certificates, old maps showing the springs and the correct boundaries of the land, and a detailed diary reporting the threats and intimidation attempts she had suffered before the fire. But the most important item was a folder containing photographs and recordings on an old cassette tape. The photos showed meetings between Robert Fletcher, Thomas, and other influential men in the region, including the then mayor, discussing maps and papers. One of the photos clearly showed document forgery being carried out. "This explains everything," murmured Sarah, carefully leafing through the papers. Mum discovered they were altering the legal boundaries of the properties, annexing lands that didn't belong to them, especially those with access to the springs. And your mother, as the legitimate owner, was the only obstacle, completed Jim, understanding the dimension of the conspiracy. Exactly. They needed us to disappear so no one would contest the possession of these lands. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to control her emotions. But Mum was smarter. She kept all this here, a place that only Luna knew, and made sure I escaped. The sound of breaking branches interrupted the conversation. Luna raised her head, alert, her ears pointed toward the source of the noise. The bees, which had calmed down, began to buzz again, agitated. "Someone followed us," whispered Jim, picking up his rifle. From among the trees appeared Thomas, accompanied by two unknown men, all armed. "Knew that Mayor would end up bringing trouble," said the neighbor, his fake smile now replaced by an expression of pure evil. "Clever girl coming back after so long, just like your mother, aren't you?" Sarah stood up, the box of documents firmly held against her chest, fear giving way to anger. "You were involved in the fire, weren't you, Thomas? It was you who planned everything." The man shrugged, arrogant. "Planning is a very strong word. Let's say I just facilitated things. It was a good deal. Those lands were worth a fortune, especially with the spring damming project the Fletchers wanted to implement. And my mother. What happened to her?" A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "Your mother was too stubborn. She wouldn't leave when the fire started. She stayed behind, looking for something. We presumed it was these documents." "You let her die," accused Sarah, tears of anger streaming down her face. "I don't know if she died," replied Thomas, surprising everyone. "We never found her body. Some say she managed to escape, that she's still in hiding to this day. Others believe she was consumed by the fire. What matters is that you, girl, were presumed dead too, which made things much easier." Jim kept his rifle pointed, but knew they were at a numerical disadvantage. "What do you intend to do now, Thomas? Silence us too? The whole town already knows about Sarah's return. You can't make everyone disappear." Thomas laughed, a cold sound without humor. "The town knows Emma Hayes, the curious journalist. No one knows it's Sarah Wilson who's back. And as for you, old Jim, well, accidents happen to elderly people who live alone, especially those who go riding in rough terrain." Before anyone could react, a deafening noise took over the clearing. The bees, which had gathered in greater numbers during the conversation, suddenly formed a massive swarm, attacking the three armed men. Thomas and his accomplices screamed, dropping their weapons to try uselessly to protect themselves from the furious insects. "Run!" shouted Jim to Sarah, taking advantage of the confusion. But the young woman didn't need encouragement. She was already on Luna, who seemed to perfectly understand the situation. With a single fluid movement, Sarah extended her hand to help Jim mount behind her, and the white mare shot down the trail, followed by Thunder, who ran free at her side. The screams of the men being attacked by the bees were soon left behind, swallowed by the distance and the wind that whistled in their ears during the desperate escape. They didn't return to Jim's farm. It would be the first place they would look for them. Instead, they headed for town, directly to the sheriff's office, where Sarah could reveal her true identity and present the evidence she had just recovered. Sheriff Michael Anderson, a serious and respected man who had taken office just 5 years ago, listened to the complete story with attention. He examined the documents, the photographs, and made copies of everything before even officially recording the testimony. "This is very serious," he said, adjusting his glasses on his nose while studying the evidence. "It involves important figures in town. It's going to cause a political earthquake." "Are you going to investigate?" asked Sarah, concerned about the possibility of interference from the local powerful figures. "I'm going to do more than that," replied the sheriff firmly. "I'm going to request support from the FBI. This goes beyond my jurisdiction, involves forgery of federal documents, land appropriation, and the Bakers and Fletchers won't be able to hush up the case." While the sheriff made the necessary calls, Jim received news that left him dumbfounded. His granddaughter Olivia had arrived in town that morning as a surprise and was looking for him at his farm. "My God, she could be in danger," he murmured. Imagining the worst, The sheriff immediately sent a patrol car to the property to ensure the young woman's safety. To Jim's relief, they found Olivia safe and sound, having just arrived and finding her grandfather's absence strange. She was brought to the sheriff's office, where she received with astonishment the incredible story that Jim and Sarah had to tell. Olivia Miller was 26, a newly graduated biologist who maintained a relationship of deep affection and admiration with her grandfather. Since her grandmother's death, she visited him less frequently due to her studies but never failed to call every week. The young woman with curly hair and lively eyes quickly became enchanted with Sarah and her story. "This is unbelievable," she said, as the three of them waited in the sheriff's office waiting room for the sheriff's return. "You really grew up believing you were someone else?" "Mrs. Bennett did her best to give me a normal life," explained Sarah. "It was only when I found my mother's diary and some saved documents that I began to put the pieces together." The sheriff returned with news. Thomas and his two accomplices had been located and detained. They were covered with bee stings but in no danger of death. During the initial interrogation, one of the men, fearing the possible consequences, had already begun to talk, partially confirming Sarah's story and directly implicating the current mayor, Robert Fletcher's son, in the land appropriation scheme. "You need to stay in a safe place for now," advised the sheriff. "The Fletchers have many allies in the region. It was Olivia who proposed the solution. I have an apartment in Chicago. It's not big, but we can all fit. We can stay there until the situation calms down." "And what about Luna?" asked Sarah, concerned about the mayor. "There's an equestrian center near the university campus," replied Olivia. "I can get a place for her there. I have friends who work with equine therapy." So as night fell over Millfield, an unlikely group departed toward the city. A retired teacher, his biologist granddaughter, a young woman who was rediscovering her true identity, and a white mare who, after 20 years, had finally completed her mission. In the months that followed, the investigation advanced with full force. The state press soon became interested in the case, attracted by Sarah's dramatic story and the elements of political conspiracy involving important figures from the countryside. The repercussion was so great that even national outlets sent teams to cover the development of the case. With the support of lawyers specializing in agrarian law, Sarah initiated the process to legally recover her family's lands. The original documents found in the metal box were fundamental, as were the photographic records of the forgeries. The Fletchers and their allies tried, of course, to discredit the evidence, and Sarah herself. They hired expensive lawyers and used their political influence, but the case had grown too big to be hushed up. When the DNA test results confirmed that Emma Hayes was in fact Sarah Wilson, the last public resistance of the Fletchers crumbled. Throughout this process, Jim remained at Sarah's side, offering the silent and constant support that had become his trademark. Olivia, enchanted by the story and by the strong personality of her new friend, also became deeply involved, using her knowledge of biology to study the unusual behavior of the bees that seemed to protect Luna, and by extension, Sarah. "It's fascinating," commented Olivia one night, as the three dined in the small apartment in Chicago. "There are studies on communication between bees and their keepers, but what happens with Luna is something completely different. It's almost as if the bees recognize in her a connection to their family." "Mom always said bees have memory," replied Sarah, a nostalgic smile on her lips. "That they recognize faces, voices, even emotions. She talked to them as if they were people." The case advanced rapidly. Thomas, finding himself cornered, decided to negotiate with the prosecution. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he agreed to reveal all the details of the conspiracy, including the role of each person involved on the night of the fire. It was through his testimony that the truth about Caroline Wilson finally came to light. "She managed to get out of the house," confessed Thomas. "We saw from a distance, but she was injured, staggering. We thought she wouldn't survive the night, so we didn't pursue her. When we returned the next morning to check, we found no sign of her." The revelation rekindled hope in Sarah. If her mother had escaped the fire, what had happened afterward? Was she alive somewhere, hidden as Sarah herself had been? Or had she succumbed to her injuries in some isolated spot in the forest that surrounded the property? New searches were organized by the police, this time with the care and dedication. That didn't exist 20 years before. Volunteers from the community, many of them ashamed of the passive role they had played in the past, joined the officers to search every corner of the old Maple Creek farm and the surrounding woods. Luna, the white mare that had united this entire story, became a sort of mascot for the operation. Sarah took her on each expedition, believing that if anyone could find Caroline, it would be the animal that had been so special to the family. It was during one of these searches, when it was approaching almost a year since Sarah's return to Millfield, that what many would call a miracle occurred. Luna, who was walking calmly beside Sarah in a remote area, suddenly raised her head and whinnied loudly, a sound that echoed through the hills. Before anyone could react, the mare shot down an almost invisible trail among the dense vegetation. Sarah and the search team followed her, making their way through bushes and low branches, until they reached a small clearing where stood a rustic cabin, almost camouflaged by the nature that surrounded it. The smoke that rose from the improvised chimney indicated that the place was inhabited. Luna stopped in front of the wooden door, whinnying again, this time an almost melodious sound. The bees, which had accompanied the mare throughout the journey, formed a circular pattern in the air like a silent dance. The door opened slowly, and from it emerged a figure that Sarah would recognize anywhere, at any time: Caroline Wilson. Older, with now completely white hair and some visible scars on her face and arms, but unmistakably her mother. The meeting between mother and daughter was an explosion of emotions that words could not capture. Embracing, crying, and laughing at the same time, they shared 20 years of separation in a moment of absolute reconnection. Caroline explained later, when she managed to speak through tears, that she had survived the fire, but was severely injured. Lost in the forest without strength to seek help, she had been found by an elderly couple who lived isolated in the mountains. Traditional healers, knowledgeable about herbs and secrets of the forest, they sheltered her and took care of her wounds. When I recovered enough to return, I learned that everyone believed we were dead, you and I, explained Caroline, holding her daughter's hands in hers, and that the lands had already been taken by the Fletchers. I was alone, vulnerable. Returning would mean facing those who had already tried to eliminate me once. "Why didn't you look for me?" asked Sarah, the pain of absence still fresh despite the joy of reunion. "I did," replied Caroline, a sad smile on her lips. "I went to Mrs. Bennett's house one night, hidden. I saw you sleeping, peaceful, protected. Mrs. Bennett told me you were safe, that you believed you were her niece, that you were well. I decided it was better that way, at least until it was safe to return." "And the bees? Luna? What happened to them during all this time?" Caroline caressed the muzzle of the white mare, who remained faithfully by her side. "The bees always found me, no matter where I was. It's a bond I can't explain, I just accept it. As for Luna, she disappeared on the night of the fire. I imagined she was with you, or that she had gotten lost in the forest. Recently I began to feel that something had changed. The bees were more agitated, as if they wanted to tell me something. Then I heard stories in the nearby village about a white mare that had appeared out of nowhere, and about the young woman looking for answers, about Maple Creek Farm." The news of Caroline Wilson's reappearance spread quickly, adding a new chapter to the already extraordinary story that had captured the attention of the entire state. The image of mother and daughter reunited, with the faithful white mare beside them and a swarm of bees dancing over their heads, became iconic, appearing in newspapers and magazines across the country. With Caroline's testimony, the last details of the conspiracy came to light. She confirmed everything the documents had already suggested, adding crucial information about conversations and threats she had personally received from Robert Fletcher and his associates. The legal case brought by Sarah to recover her lands gained incontestable strength. Less than 2 months after Caroline's reappearance, the court determined the full return of Maple Creek Farm to the Wilson family, plus compensation, for the 20 years of illegal use of the property. Jim, who had followed every step of this journey, felt that his mission was complete. He had been Luna's temporary guardian, the first to believe in Sarah, and a bridge between the buried past and the future that now opened up. He decided it was time to return to his own farm and resume the peaceful life he so appreciated. On the eve of his departure from Chicago, sitting on the balcony of Olivia's apartment, he shared his plans with Sarah and Caroline. "You have a lot to rebuild together," he said with his calm and direct manner. "And I have my apple trees to care for, my fences to fix." "We wouldn't be here without you, Mr. Miller," replied Sarah, gratitude evident in her voice. "It was you who rescued Luna, who sheltered me when I returned, who believed in me from the first moment." "I did nothing that any decent person wouldn't do," he retorted, deflecting as he always did when complimented. Caroline, who had developed a deep respect for the old teacher, smiled gently. "Did you know that bees never sting certain types of people? They sense something in the energy and the smell in the heart. You're like that, Mr. Miller, a man that not even bees can fail to recognize as good." The next morning, before he left, Jim received an unexpected visit. Olivia entered his room with an envelope in her hands and a determined expression on her face. "Grandpa, I don't want you to go back to the farm alone," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I asked for a leave from the university. I'm going with you." Before Jim could protest, she continued, "It's not just for your sake. It's selfish of me too. I discovered an incredible field of research with this whole story. I want to study the behavior of these bees, understand the connection they have with Luna and the Wilson family. We've already talked, and Sarah and Caroline agreed to collaborate with my research." The old man smiled, secretly relieved. The idea of returning to the empty farm wasn't as appealing as he was trying to convince himself. "And that envelope?" he asked, pointing to the paper she still held. "Oh, this." Olivia opened a bright smile. "It's a proposal. Caroline and Sarah want to form a partnership with us. Maple Creek Farm has springs that could irrigate your land. 2. They want to unite the properties to create an environmental reserve and a research center on natural beekeeping and preservation of native flora." Jim took the envelope, surprised and touched by the proposal. "They've barely recovered their land and already want to share." "It's not sharing, Grandpa, it's adding up. The lands would remain legally owned by each of us. The partnership would be for the conservation project, and come to think of it, you form quite a team, you with your knowledge of the land, Caroline. With her connection to the bees, Sarah with her determination, and me, well, I have my books and my curiosity." The idea of transforming all that saga of pain and separation into something constructive and focused on the future deeply touched Jim. After a life dedicated to teaching, being able to contribute to a project that would unite environmental preservation, scientific research, and social justice seemed the perfect epilogue to his story. In a few months, the White Oak Environmental Research and Preservation Center began to take shape. The old house at Maple Creek Farm was rebuilt, this time with space for laboratories and accommodations for researchers and students. Jim's property became the reception point for visitors, with his cozy house serving as a venue for informal meetings and lectures. Luna, the white mare that had united all the threads of this story, received a special space at the center. Free to roam throughout the property, she became a sort of mascot for the project, always accompanied by her faithful swarm of bees, which, as Olivia noted in her preliminary studies, seemed to have developed a unique and specific behavior, different from any colony ever documented. The case of the Fletchers and their associates continued in court, with new developments emerging as more people, encouraged by the example of Caroline and Sarah, began to question old agreements and suspicious documentation of their own lands. On a golden autumn afternoon, as the sun began to set behind the mountains that surrounded the now united properties, Jim sat on his favorite porch, watching Luna grazing peacefully in the distant field. Olivia was with him, making notes in her research notebook, while Caroline and Sarah walked among the newly installed beehives, their voices arriving in fragments carried by the light breeze. "You know, Grandpa," commented Olivia without raising her eyes from her notes, "I still can't fully understand the behavior of these bees. It's as if they had a collective consciousness, a memory that goes beyond what science can explain." Jim smiled, taking a sip of the chamomile tea that Sarah had prepared earlier. "Not everything needs to be explained to be true, my dear. Some connections are deeper than our capacity to understand them." Olivia looked up, thoughtful. "Like Luna, finding her way back after 20 years, like the bees protecting her all this time, like an old teacher finding a mare covered in bees exactly when she most needed to be found, he completed, with a gleam of wisdom in his eyes. The young woman smiled, understanding. Do you think none of this was coincidence? That there was a greater purpose? Jim watched the sun tinting the sky orange and pink, the first stars beginning to dot the firmament. I believe life weaves its own patterns, Olivia, and that even when we can't see the complete design, each thread has its purpose, each encounter its meaning. In the distance, Luna raised her head, attentive to Sarah's call. The bees, which were resting on nearby flowers, rose in a synchronized movement, forming a golden dance in the air tinted by twilight. Like a dance, murmured Olivia, observing the spectacle, a perfect choreography between all living beings. Exactly, replied Jim, his heart full of a satisfaction he had never imagined feeling again. A dance that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we're gone. And so, between the soft buzzing of the bees and Luna's distant whinny, a cycle closed and another began, like life itself in its eternal movement of renewal and hope. The end of the story. Dear listener, we hope that the story of old Jim, Sarah, and Luna has touched your heart. If you've made it this far, please leave a like on the video, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other emotional narratives like this one. Now tell us, do you believe the bees really had a special connection with the Wilson family, or was it all just an extraordinary coincidence? Leave your opinion in the comments.